We're working through all of our technical issues as we start these lecture series. It's been a fun
journey.
Yes, yes. I suppose I don't know if fun would be the right word to use, but yeah.
We watched one of the first ones at home. We were in Eau Claire. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's technology is good. It's great for things like this, but it's interesting to learn how to use. I suppose my major there's a lot of paper writing and book reading, so I didn't necessarily need to use it all that often, but
I learned a lot when I was teaching. And we're in COVID when they're shut down.
yep.
Do they have just a mic that the speaker can wear?
We do have this mic that works pretty well to our knowledge. But I have had professors in the past that have worn headsets and that it seems to work pretty.
Yeah, you can really hear.
Can I get you anything?
What's that?
Could I get you anything?
Oh, no, I'm just gonna talk to him and just see you guys go to.
He starts in a minute. We got a question. I didn't tell you.
All right. So the microphone works.
Must work pretty well, yeah.
Oh, well,
If we need that one, we get a good grade on the test.
that's right, yeah. You don't have to take the test, I'll do it for you. So welcome to the Kashubian Cultural Institute and Polish Museum. My name is Jeff Zurkowski. I'm the director, and my assistant director, Lindsay Susie, is running the tech program here. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about multiculturalism and Polish Romanticism. This is an era of history that's pretty close to my own lens of history and how I view things. I myself am a multiculturalist. I'm going to explain what all of that means next. And so before I get into the real details of all of this stuff, historians absolutely love our isms. You'll hear nationalism, multiculturalism, pluralism, all of these isms in today's lecture. And so I figured it would be kind of, interesting for me to explain exactly what I'm talking about. And it says an ism is defined as a distinctive practice, system, or philosophy, typically a political ideology or an artistic movement. And so Polish Romanticism is considered an artistic movement that bleeds into your political movements as well. But it doesn't really narrow it down, does it? It's pretty much anything you can turn around and make it an ism. And so I'll just try to keep that in mind and provide definitions of these things as we go, at least as to how I see them, not necessarily how everybody views them, but what I mean when I'm talking about these specific points in Polish history. Next. And so multiculturalism for me really highlights the neglected areas of history. I'm a bottom-up historian by trade, and so what I do is I look at local histories like this, heritage museums like this, and then tell stories about them as they apply to the grander narrative. And so that's what I've done with the museum, is really look at the history that was saved by Father Paul Briza and the people of the city, and taking that to a next level. What does that mean in global history? What does that mean for national history? And so I view the Kashubians as a neglected population. Obviously, not a lot of people know about them. They don't even know what a Kashubian is half the time when they walk in the museum, but are sure to leave knowing exactly what that population does. But also keeping an eye out for our women's history that's not very well explored or very well taught about. Talking about the hog line and those instances over there, and the separation of the population. Talking about a lot of different things that just aren't talked about on a normal standard, because they're not George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or some of these bigger names in history. But historians are starting to refocus, instead of looking at those bigger topics, to go down and see what the people are doing. What are the workers doing? And so it was very innovative for Father Briza to start doing this in the 70s, keeping the history of the local worker, because not everybody was doing that at the time. It's really a modern ideal that we have just started to explore, which leaves a ton of opportunity for historians to really dig in, scholars and amateurs, family historians, to dig into this ideas and really bring out what were we doing back then, rather than just looking at the nobility or the kings and queens or the main presidents and different things like that. So that's where multiculturalism really plays into my lens, not only focused on the Kashubian history, but other neglected populations as we pass through. Next. And so for Polish multiculturalism, this can be interpreted three ways, and we will interpret it three ways today. You have an historical Polish multiculturalism, which really talks about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They did have a sense of nationalism prior to the beginning of world nationalism as we know it. However, there are thousands of books that are created by historical scholars that do not know where nationalism comes from. Where did we get this idea of a nation? And in the past, did people ever identify according to their nation? So we often identify ourselves as American or Polish American or Kashubian American. But where does that come from? And has that always existed? And the answer is no. We didn't identify with our geography until the late 1800s. So the development of a Polish nation, I think, has a lot to do with Polish history, because they were extinct for 123 years without a nation. And so during that time period, we developed contemporary arguments of Polish multiculturalism, which is to create a homogeneous society. So we'll talk a little bit more about that soon. And then the last part is the ideological and political aspect of Polish multiculturalism, which is the argument that today, you can see it in the news, you can see it in articles that come up about Poland in the United States, where they're struggling with these ideas of a multicultural state. So that is where they began, is with a understanding that not everybody's the same and everybody needs to be allowed to have their own individual identity, their own individual culture. But now they have created that Polish state, and now it's no longer acceptable to be outside of that bubble. You have to act like a Polish person, speaking the Polish language and doing Polish cultural items, which is an interesting aspect to modern politics and things like that. Next. So just before we get into the nitty-gritty of what I'm talking about and explain it more so that it's more understandable, we have to understand the history of Poland. So these are modern languages that still exist in Poland today. So it's not just a Polish state. Not everybody speaks Polish. It's not unified depending on where you go. In the state, you're going to find different cultures, different languages, different populations. Belarusian, Czech, Hebrew, Yiddish, Kara, Kashubian, Lithuanian. There's 10 different Lemko dialects. So just, it's crazy to me to think about just the bottom part of Poland has 10 different languages. No bigger than a sliver of California has 10 different languages. And then you have German, Armenian, Romani, or the Gypsy population, Russian, Slavic, Tatar, Ukrainian, and then finally you have the Polish language as the majority language of the country. Next. And so one of the first things I mentioned at the museum in the tours that I give is that Poland is the land of 999 nationalities. It is 54 characters long. I will not attempt to butcher that. There's too many consonants for me to actually pronounce this correctly. But it does mean that it is a complex society and it does still exist. And this is argued, this is not actually how they would speak the 999 nationalities. That's what it translates to. No Polish person would actually say this word. It's actually grammatically incorrect, but this is a common joke that you'll see that it is such a complex society that there is a multitude of people that live there. And so we're not going to go over the 999. We would be here for the entire hour, just me listing off those populations. But some of the more important ones that we should recognize are the Kashubians, Upper, Lower, Liba. There's actually several different dialects of the Kashubian language, with those that speak a dialect around Bitov, those that have a dialect in Kartuzy, those that have a dialect up in Puck and Liba or Hell, and those that have a dialect more towards the Kashubian region below Gdansk. So even within just this one tiny area, no bigger than the size of New Jersey, we have several different populations that exist and all assign themselves to that one term of Kashubian. But there is actually a multitude. I think it was even the three authors from the 1800s that we talk about with Hermann Dudowski. Dudowski spoke Kashubian, but he spoke Grove Kashubian. So not necessarily the dialect of Bitov, it was the dialect near Viel, so the southern parts of Kashubia. And so the two populations, even between Dudowski and somebody like Anton Paler, would have spoken a different dialect of Kashubian, which is fascinating for linguists and historians alike. We have the Karaites, the Poromos, the Tatars, the Lenko, Kushebi, the Poznanian, the Kirpi populations, which is a remnants of the Baltic tribes. They're the only Baltic tribes considered to be left. That's where we also get the symmetrical Vishnaki paper cutting, is from the Kirpi population. The Kashubians that are near and have a lot of Kashubian influences. And then, your nations as far as the Ruthenians that call themselves Russians now. Sorbians, Opole, Red and White Ruthenians. I mean, there's truly an endless amount of research, and depending on the century that you're talking about, that could, change some of these names as to how they identified. But this is the problem with the Polish nation. This is the problem with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, is how do you have one government that can service all of these populations and keep them all together, right? How do we keep them working together? There's a common term in the United States history or, rhetoric that we talk about united we stand, divided we fall. Well, this is clearly a divided population, divided in language, divided in culture, but united in this idea of a nation. And so this is the time in the 1800s where the world is pushing to get rid of all of these individual populations and form nations. So it doesn't, to compare it to the Native American population, we don't want Cherokees and Iroquois and all of these, Dakotas and, I could be up here for another hour just talking about their 999 populations, but we don't want all of those, they're all Cherokee, right? So we're just going to call them all one population and make it simpler for ourselves. And I think it's very lazy. I think that, and one of the reasons I have a big problem with nationalism is because of the Kashubian story. Many people here in Winona and throughout the United States are Kashubian and have no idea, because Polish nationalism has taken over and not allowed you to actually identify as a Kashubian. Because that is a low term or almost a bad name. And so we don't want all of these complex societies. You have to get rid of your own culture and join the Polish standard. Next. And so before I get into that, I thought it would be, really interesting to explain what I mean by this Polish standard. And it's important to know that Poland didn't have a language all the way through the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They did not actually have a Polish language until the late 1800s, when they spoke, because of the Colegio Polacco in Rome, they developed a Polish language that was standard for the Colegio Polacco to teach priests how to speak with a certain language. Now, is Slavic being spoken in each of these cities? Yes. For the common peasant, you would speak Polish, but the nobility all spoke a mixture of the Slavic language and Latin. It is a form of language called macaronic. And all that means is that you take two different languages and you butt them together to create a unique language. But this would make it so that none of the peasants could actually understand the nobility. And so they were even more separated from government to all of these populations, because they were sitting on their high thrones and speaking this language that nobody understood except if they were speaking to one another. So you couldn't go out and do public speeches. You couldn't go out and speak from the pulpit. You couldn't actually go out and speak to the people to get them to rise up against the Prussians or to rise up against the Russians. So they were really disconnected from the society that they served, which was unfortunate. But what they are called Sarmatians. They don't actually even consider themselves Polish. The Polish nobility created a race called Sarmatians. It's based off an old map that was created by Ptolemy during the era of Alexander the Great. They picked up this map, decided, yeah, look at the map. It says Sarmatians right across Poland, right there. That's who we are. Now, it was really coming from an era when people were trying to determine what their origin story was. Are we Greek? Are we Roman? Are we Egyptian? Are we, what are we? And without modern technology and DNA and being able to trace us back to Indo-European countries like Iran and Iraq, they're saying, well, we come from right here. And the possibility of that is, it is very possible, but we don't actually have any evidence, and neither did they. So what they did is they created this race to separate themselves from your peasant class. And it was designed to service an elected kingship. So all of Poland had an elected king. Every so often you would elect one into office and he would serve as the king. How do you determine who is available or who is eligible to be king? Well, now you have a race called the Sarmatians that exists that distinguishes the noble class from everyone else, even though DNA, color, look, even culture is the same. There is no difference between the two. They just created it to distinguish themselves from the peasant class. Go ahead.
What period of time are you talking about? Early 1800s, late 1800s?
Right now I'm talking about right before the partitions. So from,
1780?
before 1772, I think is the mark of change with the first partition. And so, but yeah, before the 1800s, before Polish Romanticism, this is the separation and one of the reasons that they're falling. In addition to Prussian takeover and the Habsburgs and Hohenzollerns and Catherine the Great all working together against them, that had some major part too, but they didn't fight back. They say that it's because the Sarmatians kind of lied down and just stopped ruling. But that's not necessarily the case. I'm sure that's how it looked from the outside, but really they were trying. They just couldn't get their society to rise up with them. They had no sense of belonging to the Polish nation. They were Kashubian, they were Silesian, they were Pomeranian, they were Ruthenian, but none of them were Polish because there was no, that idea just didn't exist yet. Nor did it in Germany, in fact. Germany was just as separated with the Saxons and the Bavarians and the Thrunsians and the Obotrites and the Swords. They're and still are very broken apart. And so that is the idea of where nationalism comes from, is they saw that need to unify the country, which is in part a noble task. If you think about it, they're trying to rise up and survive in a European culture. However, at what cost? What is this going to cost everyone for the next couple of 100 years until we figure out that this isn't necessarily the box that we all fit in? Right? And so here's a map of 1697, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This is considered proto-nationalism. It is not true nationalism, but it is what it comes before nationalism, and that's pride in your kingdom, pride in your area that you conquered. And this goes all the way down to Crimea, deep into Ukraine, well into, not quite into Germany yet. And you can see the areas that are white there on the left that don't actually belong to the Polish kingdom, that do now belong to the Polish kingdom. And these are the places where people are trying to or want to separate currently from the Polish kingdom, because they were never actually Polish to begin with. Slavic, yes, Slavic populations stretch all the way well into Germany, all the way into Lubeck, so the center of Germany. So those are all Slavic populations, but as they Germanize, they basically get to that line right there and are stopped by the Polish kingdom from Germanizing these Slavic people. But the Pomeranians and the Silesians and the Lusatians are all in those white populations and still consider themselves partly German today. This is often why you'll get these questions in genealogy where, well, my grandmother, she claims and she, puts her foot down that she was German. But I looked at a map, modern day map, and they're located in Poland. Yes and no, they are a German living in the Polish state, which isn't a bad thing. We tend to automatically go to World War II or these things, but there's still a Slavic population. They just speak a German language and are accepting the German, Enlightenment period with science, technology, and all these types of things. But they do have this proto-nationalism because of our golden freedoms and our elected king system that exists in Poland. And so you have this pride or sense of belonging to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and mostly it's because you are in turn given those freedoms and we're considered very forward-thinking. We speak about terms of liberty and freedom well before anyone else. Yeah.
Excuse the interruption.
Oh, no, please. And so we look at these ideas all the way back to 1140. We begin talking about these terms, liberty and freedom, especially in the northern parts of Poland. It's said that the Hussars, for example, used to ride and march, and during that march, they would sing a song called Bogo Ridlija. It means the mother of God save us. And while the Hussars of the South were singing that, very Catholic orientated, the people in the North were actually singing and chanting in their marches, freedom. And so this is well before John Locke, this is well before Thomas Paine, this is well before Thomas Aquinas, this is well before, hundreds of years before the French and the English ever started talking about liberty and freedom, well before the induction of the United States. And so we are, reconciling these ideas of how do we give freedoms to the peasant class or lower class populations while still being able to run a country. I do believe that with Thaddeus Kosciuszko and other people in the American Philosophical Society, that lots of these ideas were then transposed into the U.S. Constitution. You don't just pull these things out of thin air. You see something that didn't quite work. Well, how can we change that to make it better? Not just golden liberties for your nobility, but golden liberties for, in theory, for everyone, which then progress towards what we have. Next. And if you see an ethnographic map during the age of Polish Romanticism, you'll see this is a map from 1863. Still a very diverse population. Blue is your German tribes. Red is your Slavic or Polish tribes. Then you have your Latvians, your Lithuanians, your Belarusians, and then the light green is your Ukrainians. Okay. So even understanding that today, that when the blue areas were given to Poland during the redrawing of nations after World War II, what they are doing is they're deporting all of the local German populations out of the country and replacing them with the Ukrainian Polish populations. So you'll see lots of people from Lviv, Ukraine, which is popular in the news today, living in cities like Wrocław on the other side of the country. That's what they're doing, is compiling everybody, creating what they consider to be a homogeneous Polish population. Though that's never going to happen. It's very divided, right at its center, with multitude of populations that exist within those borders.
Just like the Middle East.
Right? Yeah, basically. Yeah, the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shiites, and you draw a circle around it and call it Iraq and expect everybody to get along with each other. It's an interesting way of doing things like this. Next. So to get into the history, now that we kind of understand where I'm coming from or where we're at with the country, we have this guy at the beginning of the 1800s, right? With some books. He is considered a German living in the current, or what was Prussia. And he says, but now again I cry, my German brethren, but now the remains of all genuine folk thought is rolling into the abyss of oblivion with the last and accelerated impetus. For the last century, we have been ashamed of everything that concerns the fatherland. And so he's really talking about how divided Germany and Poland are, how many populations there are, there's all these folk cultures. And while we are coming out of that, coming out of the Renaissance era of the 1700s, and starting to industrialize in the early, late early 1800s, Germany really didn't do anything. They were at a standstill. And so there is this rise in German nationalism first, and they are the first with this individual who writes this popular book and poem. It spreads nationalism and multiculturalism in sequence. And what he's basically saying is that we have to accept the fact that our nation is a complex society. We have to accept that there are different cultures, different languages, different people that exist here. And if we don't do so, we're never going to become a unified nation. We will never succeed. There will always be blockage. We will always be divided. We will live in this rut that we live in until we figure this out. He was very popular. He was actually born in Moraj, Poland, which is North Poland, right up near, like in between Gdansk and Kaliningrad. Next. From that movement, we see the beginning of Polish Romanticism with the three bards of Polish Romanticism. But during this time, we see the first partition of Poland in 1772. You can see the first map there. They still have parts of Ukraine. They still have the Polish corridor in Gdansk, and they still have most of Lithuania, with Vilna right in the center there. Then you have the second partition, or the first partition that kind of takes away Gdansk, and then the second partition that takes even more away, leaving just Warsaw and Vilna, Lithuania. And then you have 1795, where everything is gone, and there is no Polish country. But this is also an interesting point. People often ask me, why is the Polish Constitution so important? It was written in 1791, then you were partitioned and it was gone. But it was this period of time at the beginning of the partitions where they got rid of the nobility. The Treaty of Warsaw was signed in 1773. All noble classes had to give up their nobility. They could not be in business, they could not own property, and they could not be in politics. And so they took all of these Catholic populations and split them and turned them into a serfdom class society. Whether you were noble or already a peasant, it did not matter, and you were thrown into serfdom. And this is why it's so complex for our families to trace their lineage. Does ski mean nobility? It could, it very well could. You could be, you know, if you're in Radsville, you could be related to the Radsville noble family, like John Radzlowski in Detroit. But you know, it's very hard to do so because we are all thrown back into serfdom. So from 1773 all the way to, well, from forever, there is no such thing as a noble class, and that creates lots of complexities. Now, if you do the genealogy and you can trace it back before 1772, that would be something. I do have a lot of records from the 1700s in my family, but none of them match because it seems like they purposely don't want us to be able to track that back. Because nobility is, well, it's kind of a derogatory term in Eastern countries. You were the problem. You were the reason that we fell. So nobody really even wants to associate themselves as a noble class, which is kind of an interesting part of that. But yeah, so the country disappears. And we begin what is called Polish Romanticism. We don't have a country. Go ahead.
After the nobility left, the political structure, mayors or
It was all
German dictators, obviously. But
Yep. All owned
other
by
local government.
they sent in Prussians, Austrians, or Russians. And so you had agents that would travel to these areas and then rule from the same buildings, but as the German. So for example, in the state of Prussia, they have what was called German Junkers. German Junker was no different than a plantation owner here in the United States. He would have one manor house and he would rule the entire village. And he would have control over those populations. So some of our early folklore talks about in this period, how the Kashubian specifically would sing songs about taking their ride to the master, bringing our goods and services to the master, hoping we make him enough money so that he will give us goods and services during the winter.
Carpetbaggers.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a good way of putting it. So, but next. And so we enter into, this Polish Romanticism, and it's considered an artistic movement with poetry. There's lots of paintings that exist from this time. And it coincides mostly with Adam Mickiewicz. Adam Mickiewicz is a very popular poet. During this time, he's considered the father of Polish Romanticism. And it runs from about 1820s during this time all the way till 1863 and the January uprising in which they were defeated. So you could say that period of time fits within those boxes, but I really believe that there's always a period of time that leads up to that, and then there's always a period of time in which it has to unwind. And we'll talk about that more.
It's interesting that is the date that Winona Polish started. Brown family and all that.
That's right.
You're not one of Gabe's, but
That's right. And so we talked about Polish Romanticism, mostly with the introduction of Adam Mickiewicz, who wrote Pantatius, which is a very Polish Romantic version of history and poetry that exists. We have several copies of its museum in both English and Polish. This is highly venerated throughout the Polish community for this beginning of the idea of belonging to Poland. And we carry a lot of that Romanticism even into today. That's why I don't think it's fully ended in 1863. I think the idea is still with us, but maybe the active politics behind Polish Romanticism end in 1863 without gaining much of a movement or a backing beyond that. And then it changes into Polish nationalism, and we'll talk about how that happens at the end of this. Give you a moment to read that, and then we'll go on to the next slide. But Adam Mickiewicz was born actually in Belarus. He was a Polish family that was treated as a foreigner. So he was a Polish person living in modern day Belarus. Belarus formerly belonged to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He was more than likely a lesser noble family that moved to the area when they were colonizing that as they were expanding. But then was treated as a foreigner when he lost all of his nobility, probably his grandpa or father maybe. So anyway, he comes out with three very distinct books: the Forefathers, the Sir Thaddeus, and then Drzelia, which means beautiful in Lithuanian. And these books are very influential. They serve as propaganda. They serve as inspiration to people to start romanticizing Poland. And all that really means is that in these books, he venerates the land. He claims that Polish forests are the best forests in the world. Claiming that Polish fields are the most fertile for growing food in the entire world. Really just living up your own community. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But it is the first time that they start really connecting their identity to the geography in which they're from. And that's really universal around Western civilization. At the same time, France is doing the same thing. England's doing the same thing. This is really the first time that Western culture is starting to develop these ideas of belonging to a land, not necessarily just the city that you're from, because that was always the thing. You would be, I am John from London. I am, Grzmala from Brandenburg, or, you would have that city association. But as far as a nation or a large lot of land that you would identify with, this is really when it starts, is with these three books. And in contrast to all of the modern books that you'll find, they often end this idea of a growing national society, and they draw a line on Germany, on modern Germany, and say, well, we don't know what happened over there, so we're not going to talk about it. We'll just talk about the German experience. And I think it's really important that we include this Polish story. Because while the Germans are fighting to be German, the Polish are also fighting back and saying, we're not German, we're Polish. And so it's really twofold. While the Germans are wanting everybody to unify and standardize and all be German, all speak to this language, you have to eat the same way, you have to have the fork and knife to be able to eat. That's all a part of standardizing what it means to be German, so that you can recognize somebody that's German across the room. They eat with fork and knife, and they don't scrape the spoon across the plate, making all that crazy noise that Slavic people do. They use the knife and do it properly. So it's these recognizable things that she can see. Go ahead. And so Mikovich starts what's called the Society Filmas. Senator Nikolai Novoselic, and it led the investigation into Philomath and Philomath activities. And they are really designed to spread Polish nationalism. Mikovich was arrested in 1823. Polish Prussian governments did not want him engaging in this idea of promoting the Polish nation. Be no different than a revolutionary unit like Ukraine today, trying to separate from Russia. You want to have your autonomy, your own sovereignty, you're tired of the partition system, and you want to go back to the Polish kingdom. And they were underground, they had to be. Most of these books were not published in public and sent out to the public. They were copied in-house and sent to these individual societies to teach this idea. And so these are the 5 major philomaths that existed, pushing these ideas, being the leaders of different society groups, and we'll talk about each of them individually. Next. So the second bard after Adam Mikovich is Julius Slowacki. Born 1809, lived a short life of 40 years, and died in 1849. But he is one of the 3 bards of Poland. But his work was more about the Slavic paganism. So the Kashubians and their beliefs in vampires and werewolves, and the Easter traditions, and the Viglia ceremony before Christmas, those types of aspects. He wanted us to celebrate our Slavic heritage, our pagan heritage, as well as the Christian heritage. So every spring they go and they drown the Morzana in the river. In August, they put out the wreaths and do what was a fertility ceremony to have births at the right time of the year. So you would celebrate these types of things in July and August. He wanted us to remember those things, that even as we're advancing in society, we're having science and better music and more technology, let's not forget about our Slavic heritage. The other one was Shepherd Zygmunt Krasinski, 1812 to 1859. Again, not very old when he died, but Krasinski was the most famous member of the noble Krasinski family. His mother was actually a Radziwill. Radziwill is a high noble family in Poland, known all the way back to Queen Jadwiga. So Queen Jadwiga was a Radziwill as well, and they were always in the higher echelons of Polish nobility. And so as a nobleman, teaching about Polish Romanticism, he had a very high platform in which to speak from, and people listened to him, creating this idea of an uprising. And of course, we have other contributors to Polish Romanticism, with Chopin being world famous for his classical music. That is a picture of him. This is in the Polish Romantic style. So you'll find a lot of these style of paintings in Polish museums, especially at the National Museum in Warsaw. I mean, these paintings are like 8 feet tall and about 20 feet long, but they are beautiful when you're that close to them, because you always see them in like a tiny frame. But I mean, these are wall paintings that they've done. And so this is just a picture of Chopin playing the piano. Prince Radzivill's salon, and dated in 1887. So outside of the 3 main bards, there are some other influential characters that exist. Severin Gorzinski, who was a Polish Romanticist, and in 1820 was the leader of the Union of Free Polish Brotherhoods. Fought in the Battle of Warsaw. Started the Polish People's Society in Krakow in 1835. In 1838, he immigrated to France and developed the Wyznanka, which is ideologically connected with the Polish Democratic Society. And again, this is about forming a Polish nation under these democratic or very liberal ideas at the time of accepting a multicultural population. And one of my favorite guys in all of history, you know, that you find a favorite history or a guy in history. And me personally, I try to dig into all the dirt, trying to find out what's wrong with them, because there's not, you know, there's never a guy that's perfect. But I have yet to find anything against Joseph Pilsudski. That's why he's my favorite. I'm usually able to tear people apart. Even Abraham Lincoln, I have my beefs with. So, you know, he's a fairly decent president, very, very venerated at least. But I can't find anything yet. It doesn't mean I'm done digging, but it just means
You like
that
to
I
have fun, don't you?
yeah, I do. I love this. But he was after one of the first people to lead the country after 123 years of extinction. A lot of people say that without Pilsudski, we would not have a Polish nation today. So he's highly venerated in Poland, highly venerated in our war room with his own bust and paintings. But what he did was he turned this Polish Romanticism and this multicultural idea and made it a national standard. So now you have to accept the fact that Poland is a multilingual, multicultural population. And if you can just do that, you can connect this country together to fight back and regain the West Slavic nation. And that included the indigenous populations, the last indigenous tribes like the Kashubians. And he come up and the Drudowski, when Drudowski is talking about there is no Kashubia without Poland, there is no Poland without Kashubia, he is thinking about Pilsudski. He is talking about what Pilsudski actually did. And Pilsudski went up to Kashubia and he convinced them that becoming a part of the Polish nation was the best thing for them, the best thing for their survival. They had Prussians on either side of them, and there was, you know, really no escape for them. So if they joined the community that belonged to the Vistula River, then they could form a Polish nation. Understanding that Poland relied on Gdańsk as an export city to be able to go get all of their exports out of the country and be able to make money. So without Kashubia, Poland would have disappeared. And without Poland, Kashubia would have become just another part of Germany. Which leads us to Polish nationalism. So they had it right for about 20 years, but they didn't have enough time to develop their state. With the takeover of Germany, not only in World War I, but in World War II as well, stifling their growth. But they did have it for just a moment, understanding just how complex their society was. They had everybody together, they reformed the nation, they reintroduced the 1791 Constitution, really began pushing these ideals, lost all of that, experienced a period of uprisings with the January uprising of 1864 that ended the Romanticism era, the restoration of Polish state in 1918, and by 1945, so several years later, they finally had developed a homogeneous nation. This is why currently a lot of people are kind of mad at me for talking about this history, especially the Kashubians as a separate nation or a separate population of people. And it's because it took them so long to unify everybody into a Polish standard, so that where everybody could agree and not fight with one another. And so by 1945, then you have what is being Polish. And so even in the United States, we have to kind of think about that. As our grandparents were born or lived in 1919, did they even consider themselves Polish? Would they? Could they? Because did it exist? Would they have recognized that? Or would they have considered themselves Kashubian, Silesian, or all of the individuals? Now, if they're from Warsaw, like my grandmother, she is 100% Polish and pushes that Polish, we are Polish. I don't care what you say about these Kashubians, we're Polish type attitude. But she is also from that central part of Poland. that isn't as affected as its borders, because those other occupying countries would go into those areas and treat those borderlands like absolute garbage. Austria would sell entire villages off when they took over. Russia was deporting the population actively into the United States and into Siberia. And then Russia was taking over the population of Warsaw and sending them to Siberia as well. So plays into that. But the restoration or the moving on. You have that Soviet occupation from after World War II all the way till 1989, still stifled, still having to obey these Russian standards. But as they were freed in 1989, we see this rise in modern nationalism or neo-nationalism. And what we're seeing now is a problematic situation because they pushed so hard to become a unified nation. They forgot the main point or the main structure of what that meant. They forgot this entire lecture, basically. And so in 2015, we have thousands march to burn the EU flag. They don't want to be a part of the EU anymore. They don't want to be a part of Western culture. They would want to only focus on Poland, and that's it. The rest of the world is not their problem. November 12th, 2019, we have another national independence march where they're screaming God, nation, and nationalism as the only three important things in the world. But that really negates their origins. They forgot their history. And as Pilsudski says, those that do not recognize the past and change it, to those that do not recognize the past often do not deserve a future. So even today, in January and February, we saw the Belarusian border with the Iraqis and the Kurds, which happen to be the allies of the United States, which is very interesting dynamic as to why they're up there in the first place. Because this is the population that we befriended. I have personal experience with this. We didn't want the Sunnis in charge. Saddam Hussein was a Sunni. We didn't want the Shiites in charge because that's Iran. So we worked with the Kurds and we wanted the Kurds to take control of the country. When that failed, when Donald Trump left the country, he deserted the Kurds after we had worked with them for over 20 years.
Just another civil war.
Yeah. And so by deserting them, they lost the power of the country, and slowly the Sunnis took back over. So it's right back in the same hands as it used to be. So that 20 years of fighting honestly didn't do us much good of anything. And these populations are now refugees around the world. So they're not coming to take over. They're not coming to storm the borders or bring Muslim traditions to Poland. They're not there for any of these political reasons. They're there because the United States put them there. I think that's an important distinguishment. So sorry, Poland, it's our fault. But it is a very violent action. So what we have developed in Poland is, and really in the United States, is when we were designing nationalism, what we were designing was a very accepting culture. You had to be accepting of multi-languages, as you saw, multicultures, and then once we formed that, we maintained what is called a dominant culture. So now in the United States, it is, considered to be white Americans that have the dominant culture in the United States. And if you don't act like this, or, resist pressing two for English because one is Spanish or being upset with that idea, that's called being culturally pluralistic. You're accepting of other cultures in the country, but they need to start getting rid of their culture and start acting like us, because we're the best. We're the nation. We are what makes this country, and anybody outside of that is an outsider. And that's not really what nationalism was originally intended for. It's not how it initially formed. So if they would have tried to form nations under cultural pluralism, we would not have nations in this country. We would still all be back in those tribal situations. So this idea of, creating a very understanding society that accepts all of our people and talks about all our people, talks about Native history, talks about our Appalachian people or people down in New Orleans, I can't understand because they really don't speak English. They do, but I'm, you know, that those dialects that exist in the United States. So if we don't accept those populations, you know, what can happen? So they turn from multiculturalism to cultural pluralism. There's one standard, and this is what Germany did as well. So I always point this out. It's a World War II Nazi ideology, and it is maintained in Poland now, and it is maintained in the United States. There is one dominant culture. You need to act German. You can't be Catholic. You can't be disabled. You can't be Jehovah's Witness. You can't be, you know, you have to act this certain specific way. I almost call it the Borg, and I don't know how many Star Trek fans there are, but I could watch every single one. And so the Borg with Jean-Luc Picard, and you know, you have to become a part of this efficient workforce. You know, not have your own individuality, but join the Borg and become a part of the collective, right? And so if you're not a part of the collective, then you are othered and therefore treated differently, or in the case of the Borg and the Nazis, just slaughtered, trying to assimilate everyone into this one standard. And that is where cultural pluralism leads, by creating a dominant culture that overthrows everyone else, which is interesting how that works. But I just put this up because Poland is still very multicultural, even though it considers itself Polish or homogeneously Polish population. These are all the different people that still exist there today. With Kashubians up in Pomerania, farther Pomeranians, which are a group of immigrants that did not live there before. We deported all the Germans out of the area, moved in people from around the area of Lodz, in the central parts of Greater Poland into the Pomeranian area. Neumark has always been German, still very German today. East Lusatia, you have the Lusatian population, very German dialect, if you will, with a mixture of German and Slavic. Lower Silesia, Upper Silesia, Lesser Poland, the Polish mountains, Red Ruthenia, West Police, Slovakia, Serbia, Romania, Oberland, all of these populations still exist and are unique. So if you're traveling to Poland, this is a perfect map, because you can go to Kashubia and then go 20 miles and end up in Pomerania, which has its own unique culture. If you go to the fairs, the carnivals, those different things, they'll be wearing different outfits, they'll be singing different songs, they'll have different unique aspects to that culture. You drive all the way down south to the Polish mountains, and all of a sudden you're hanging around the Górales with their wool suits, fancy embroidery, playing Polish bagpipes, all these different crazy things, the bazuna. And so this is kind of my travel map. I want to go to all these places and experience all of those cultures before they're gone. But it's very interesting when you talk about a society that comes out on the news and talks about how we only accept Polish people or Polish like-minded people here in this country. We're not going to accept any of these others, when itself is very complex society. And so what are they on the road to again? They're on the road to this upper level cultural pluralistic society where you create the Sarmatians, right? That originally existed, and everybody else is the lower class population. And what happened? They fell apart. And so we're headed down the same exact road again. And we don't have that history in the United States, but we're headed down that same road as well. If we separate from each other and create these little sections, what's going to happen to us? You know, it's just a matter of time before Canada and Mexico and Russia partition the United States, and we create our own problems. So it's a warning. So more specifically, the reason I do this lecture and did it in the university when I taught was because of this idea that there is no Kashubia without Poland and no Poland without Kashubia. But yet, if we still go with this right-wing policy with cultural pluralism, and this last election almost lost Kashubia. We were this close to losing Kashubia completely. The Kashubian Congress is a threat to be shut down. The language is a threat to stop being taught in schools, and it is just a matter of one election away. If the Law and Justice Party that's currently in power in Poland would have won more votes this last election, they would have completely gotten rid of this idea of Kashubia. And so for us specifically, and our mission and goal to keep the Kashubian people alive and keep telling the story and teach about our uniqueness and our unique history and our unique story, we have to fight for fight against cultural pluralism. Because it's still a problem today. March 19th, 2024, we noticed a news article on a state-run news website from Poland that allowed this to be released. Herrings are not fish and Kashubians are not human. Again, there's still this pushback that these people that don't want to act Polish, they don't want to act like our standard, they want to have all these crazy ideas still, they don't want to adopt to the Borg. Therefore, they are not human. They do not deserve to live. And we know from history that once you start dehumanizing a population, it's easier to kill them off. And so where are we at in history? Where are we going in history? And then how do we learn from that history here in the United States? It's the same, humanity doesn't vary very differently in how we act around the world. We all have our different culture, all different ways of doing things, but in the end, humans are humans. And once you start dehumanizing people, that's when you get into real big trouble. And so what could we learn from this here in the United States? And how can we help our Polish nation as well? So I go over there and I speak at the Kashubian Congress. I talk to TVP, the national news, and I really push this idea of multicultural acceptance is the only way forward, because you saw what doing this, Sarmatianism and the Polishness, Polish nationalism, made your country fall several times. So maybe we can learn from that in the United States without trying to get too political, about who to vote for or whatever. I don't necessarily care. You're free to vote for however you want, but just to get in there and to realize that accepting the others of our country is very important. If we don't figure it out soon, I don't believe that we can last very much longer as a country. We have to accept our the Black culture that was created by slave owners in the South. We have to accept that there were, Spanish people or Mexicans, mestizos, that lived in the United States before the borders changed. And so they didn't become American by moving or immigrating here. They were already American, probably more so than we are. And or the Chinese populations on the East Coast, or just everything that we have going on here is this melting pot society. If we don't figure out how to be more accepting and teach those other cultures to our children so that they understand and are not afraid of what they see, acceptance of mosques in our country, those types of things, it's just, that's the way forward. We've seen it work several different times to unite the country. And when you take that away and you provide a dominant culture to assign everybody to, it takes away from our own. Even today, there are people that would say that white people have no culture. And I just have to say, well, if we were more accepting of our culture, we would probably celebrate it more. And Polish people tend to isolate themselves to try and continue that Polish presence here in the U.S. And it's our biggest downfall. It's one of the reasons that Polish museums are closing. Polish organizations are no longer in operation because they have siloed themselves too much and are a minority already in the U.S. So if they would open up and allow other people to explore Polish events and sell pierogies down in Mexico, we would probably be better off by allowing other people to experience our culture rather than coming to the museum on the East End. We're just going to celebrate Polish culture here, and it's only us and it's only Polish people. You have to be Polish to be a part of it. That type of thinking cannot exist anymore with any certain amount of future attached to that. So this explains a lot of the reasons or the background of why I do what I do here at the museum, what I teach at the museum, and my own personal biases, because this is all biased. I have my reasons, but I am biased in my own fashion. And that bias is really, one, to keep the Kashubian people alive. And the second part to push us into the next generation. And what we're going to do to teach this to our kids so that they remember our heritage, our culture, our way of life without it disappearing. So thank you all for coming today. I appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something. Any feedback, just let me know. You guys, I'll get my card with my email. Anybody online or watching later, please feel free to email me any questions and I will answer them as soon as I can. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you. I do have a tidbit, speaking of history.
Oh, I'm
Coming up in an auction next month is the first edition from Copernicus, claiming that